You know what makes every outfit look better? The right bra from Third Love. Their bras make it easy to ultimate cleavage, a smooth look, or even stop your shirt buttons from pulling. They make over 60 sizes, including half cups you won't find anywhere else, so you'll find your perfect fit. Third Love solves bra problems, or what they call broblems. Real women test every style they make. Comfort and support are guaranteed. So stop settling for bad bras. You deserve better. Get your problem solved today. Save $15 on your first order with code podcast15 at thirdlove.com.
Mochi Health is here to help you start your weight loss journey with caring, personalized support. Meet one-on-one with board-certified obesity doctors and registered dietitians who truly listen and understand your unique needs. Eligible patients can access affordable GLP-1 medications delivered right to their door each month. No insurance? No problem. Mochi Health accepts FSA and HSA, making care accessible and affordable. And with 24/7 customer service, you'll never feel alone on your path to better health. Get started with Mochi Health today. Take the free quiz at joinmochi.com and use code AUDIO40 at checkout for $40 off your first month of membership. That's joinmochi.com with promo code AUDIO40.
Hey, this is Jason again. Since the audience for the podcast has grown in the last year, I thought I'd re-release some of my favorite episodes from the previous 2 years. I wanted to share a meaningful episode that I did with Allison Dickson of the Vintage Villains podcast and many listeners who are on the live with us. It's on the 1973 disappearance of Katherine and Sheila Lyon from my home state of Maryland. Both episodes are dropping today, so check them out. I hope you enjoy them. This is part 2.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in here to say that, the apologists for the CIA are wrong. Torture doesn't work. Developing relationships, having conversations really works. And so, a good interrogation begins a bit like an interview on my other podcast, building trust, working people toward revealing more, finding genuine, real connections between you and them, common interests that you have, and having real conversations. In my other work, we use rapport building too in clinical psychology, where we have to convince people to trust us with their deepest secrets to help them, right? The whole purpose is to help them, and that's hard enough. In journalism or law enforcement, you have to get people to trust you and convince them to share their deepest secrets and rarely offer them any benefit and no discernible reason that they should actually share them with you. So it really requires a special kind of rapport building.
History is riddled with stories of murderous kids. You'll learn about many of them here. And remember, there are some very similar still unsolved cases involving young girls in places that Welch's carnival was known to stop. So it's likely that day at the mall was not his first rodeo at kidnapping. It just so happens to be the one that caught the most attention. Welcome back for our second episode on the Vintage Villains podcast and a true crime bonus episode of my friend Jason Blair's podcast, The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm your host, Allison Dickson, and we are talking, of course, about the case of the Lyon sisters.
I'm Jason Blair.
And in our first episode, we took you through some of the turmoil of 1975, a time when we were just a year out from freshly disgraced President Richard Nixon, a worldwide energy crisis, and the beginning of the end of our war in Vietnam. And we discussed how Ted Bundy was still active and the aftermath of the Watergate scandal that was unfolding. And President Gerald Ford began an effort to rein in the Central Intelligence Agency. So there was a whole lot going on, of course, in 1975. But then we quickly got to the story that Jason had brought to my attention that took place, began on March 25th, 1975 with the disappearances of Katherine and Sheila Lyon in suburban Maryland.
Yeah, in that episode, we discussed the disappearances of 10-year-old Sheila and 13-year-old Katherine from the Wheaton Plaza Mall in Maryland, the manhunt to find them, multiple witnesses across the border in Virginia who saw what they thought was the girls. some early suspects in the case and the discovery of a name in a file of a man named Lloyd Lee Welch. He lived with his parents nearby in Hyattsville, Maryland. And we also sort of began to explore how cold case detectives who reopened the case in 2011 couldn't tell whether Lloyd was a witness or a suspect. We discussed a little bit about Lloyd's criminal history, including a series of sexual assaults on children, and his family members' recollections of a trip he and his girlfriend, Helen, made to his extended family's property more than 200 miles south, deep in Appalachia on Taylor's Mountain. Family members told cold case detectives about a bloody bag that Lloyd showed up with on that spring and a fire that raged for days that had a noxious smell. We also discussed a sexual offender and murderer named Ray Molesky, who had ties to the case and perhaps to Lloyd.
Yeah. And if you haven't heard the first episode, definitely go back and listen just to get the background on this. That's what we largely covered. And we're going to pick up at the point where cold case detectives had found Lloyd already serving a long prison sentence in Delaware after being convicted of sexual assault on a 10-year-old girl. And investigators had gone to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit and Violent Crime Apprehension Program, known as VICAP, to pull Lloyd's full criminal history and find places where missing children may have aligned with his travels.
Yeah. And so we're going to just sort of jump off where we left off. We're talking about one prominent case that the analysts found. They found a number of hints, and one was strikingly similar as they were looking at missing persons cases in areas where Lloyd had traveled. This one was similar to the Lyon sisters case. Welch was a carnival worker in December 1974. The carnival he was working in was going through Fort Worth, Texas, where 3 teenage girls disappeared from a mall, never to be seen again. A December 31st, 1974 article in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram described concern for the 3 girls who had disappeared from the Seminary South Shopping Center. It was 17-year-old Rachel Trela, 14-year-old Renee Wilson, and 9-year-old Julie Ann Mosley. They vanished after telling relatives they were going to the mall. The families received a forged note, similar to the sort of extortion that John, the Lyon's father, got. A forged note that said it was from his wife, or the wife of one of the fathers, saying the girls had gone to Houston, but the signature didn't match. The girls were never found, and the case had gone cold. The detectives had seen Lloyd as a witness first, but now they worried they had stumbled across a serial killer.
And that's really interesting because, a lot of people that, weren't sure that, the cops had sort of fed information to Lloyd and all this stuff so that he could start giving them details they wanted to hear. This was completely new information. So just to reestablish that for people. And of course, again, they saw him as a witness to whom they thought had really done it, Ray Molesky. But now, of course, we have this serial killer. And so they convinced Welch, who was in the Delaware prison at the time, to sit and talk with them on March 25th, 1975, to see what he saw when he was there.
And it was really, Allison, this was really about, can this man, who also happens to be a pedophile, can he, and that's why he may have been paying attention to the girls, can he really identify the limping man he described who would have been Ray Molesky? It truly was going in to see him as a witness. So
Yeah.
8 interrogations later, the detectives had heard so many stories that it made their head spin. And I'm sure it's going to make your head spin tonight. Unprompted in the first interview, Lloyd brought up the Lyon sisters. They read him his rights, but Lloyd declined to have a lawyer. Detective Davis took the lead in the conversation. The other detectives, they watched on closed circuit TV in another room. They talked about Lloyd's other charges, his relationship with Helen, who he had met at 16 and she was 20. And they had spent most of their time together in the 1970s. During that time, she lost one child and gave birth to 3 others. One interesting moment was when Lloyd asked the detectives, after they brought up the Lyon sisters, whether Helen, who he didn't know had died of cancer years earlier, had brought up his name in connection with the case. So they tried to get the names of the Helen's children out of Welch to see what they could find out. Detective Davis encouraged him to reconnect with his children. This is sort of a part of the rapport building. Davis asked about what work Lloyd wanted to do when he got out, which was sort of absurd given the length of his sentence.
Well, that, and also Lloyd was counting on trying to get some sort of a speedy kind of like pardon of like get 5 years lobbed off a sentence. I think he was going through a process of trying to get that done, to get his sentence shortened. And so
what can happen when you latch on to people's pipe dreams.
Right. And you're right. You're so right about that need to build rapport. And anybody who reads this book by Mark Bowden, you can read a lot of this interrogation or watch the videos of it, in fact, and you'll see that happening.
Yeah. And I just want to jump in here to say that, the apologists for the CIA are wrong. Torture doesn't work. Developing relationships, having conversations really works. And so, a good interrogation begins a bit like an interview on my other podcast. Building trust, working people toward revealing more, finding genuine, real connections between you and them, common interests that you have, and having real conversations. In my other work, we use rapport building too in clinical psychology, where we have to convince people to trust us with their deepest secrets to help them, right? The whole purpose is to help them, and that's hard enough. In journalism or law enforcement, you have to get people to trust you and convince them to share their deepest secrets and rarely offer them any benefit and no discernible reason that they should actually share them with you. So it really requires a special kind of rapport building.
Yeah, I completely agree with you here. And we noticed this throughout the interview when, for instance, and I'll bring her up later, but Kate Leggett, I think her name is, she was one of the detectives who, built this career on busting sex criminals and taking really good polygraph tests, like asking the right questions in a polygraph test to try to elicit some idea of the truth. And she would do this by finding the things that move someone emotionally like this, finding the things that they want to be told that they're a good person. They want to be told that they didn't mean to do this, they didn't mean to be this way, and then you get in on that side, you thread that needle in there and you show some sympathy and maybe a little bit of admiration, kind of, stroke the ego a little bit. And so you really see them putting that on, and how that works with Lloyd in particular. It takes a little bit to crack him, but they finally get there at some point.
Yeah. And it can be sort of like, it can be a dark place when you're, I've had times where some of the boards that I've worked on have had me come in to investigate things, different issues, some of them not particularly pretty, but I find in the rapport building, you really have to put yourself in the shoes of the other person.
Mm-hmm.
Some other interrogators aren't like this. They sort of like focus on understanding them. But I think the best ones, you get in their heads and you're understanding why they do the things they do. And it can be a pretty dark place. So, at this point in the interview, Davis went on to ask Welch about Molesky, showed him a picture. Welch said, quote, "That's the freaking guy who had the damn car I was telling you about, the one who is the minister." He said, Lloyd said he was absolutely certain that Molesky had given him a ride once or twice to Helen's house, and that was it. Lloyd said he had no memory of his old statement that he had made to police that they had found in the file, and said that he did a lot of drugs during that time, and that might be why he didn't remember it. So Lloyd also denied any involvement pretty spontaneously without even being asked. And the detectives came up with a theory that Lloyd might have been one of the boys abused by Molesky. And that possibly roped Lloyd into helping with the kidnappings. So that was sort of their third potential option. And so later in the interview, Lloyd made a really odd comment. Detective Davis took the opportunity to ask Lloyd for his theories, which is another interrogator's trick, by the way.
Like, what do you think happened?
Yeah, well, you ask somebody for their theory, and then all of a sudden their theory includes either, well, we'll see in a sec, but includes some piece of evidence nobody knows about, or like Lloyd, as we'll see, it's pretty telling. So what happened when they asked Lloyd for this theory? Welch said, well, my opinion is that he killed him and raped him. He killed him and he probably burned him. I don't know. Detectives thought themselves, burn them? Right? No one said anything about burning anyone. They found that statement so odd, right? Sexual assault seems like something that would come to mind, but why burning?
Yeah, I would say that at that point, and I think the documentary about this also did a really good job of saying that this was a bit of a turning point, a breaking moment for them, because they had been hammering away at this dude for months. And by the way, this whole interrogation process was about 18 to 22 months, I believe. So they went down there a lot, had a lot of conversations with this guy, and they would be run around like in a maze. But this for me was also the moment that sealed it for me. At the very least showed that he knew a lot more than we could have imagined, because it's such a specific thing to bring up. And I find it interesting that he doesn't want to pin it on the man who's already dead too. He could have very easily taken all the outs the detectives had given him, that Molesky had victimized him too. It would have been so easy. So it's just very strange to me that of all the lies that he could have told and did tell, he simply could not go with the simplest one that would have likely just ended the investigation right there. The cops were eager to pin it on Molesky. So I found myself, as he's revealing these new details and stuff, like, well, maybe we'll find out a reason why he's so reluctant to go down this road. And then now he's mentioning burning when nobody else had said it before. So this is not something that Lloyd had been fed. This was something he was giving them because it was giving him power.
So over the course of the subsequent interviews, Lloyd told a couple of really inconsistent statements. So first, in his 1975 statement, he told the story of seeing a strange man with the two girls miles away from Wheaton Plaza. Second, in the second version, he told the Molesky story and seeing a man who he recognized leading them from the mall and putting them in a car. The detectives told Lloyd that the police department was considering going public with his case. And like many sex offenders, Lloyd worked really hard to keep his offenses quiet. Some people might say that's out of embarrassment, but I don't think that's always the case. I think sometimes it's out of embarrassment. Sometimes if you are a sexual offender and a lot of people in your community know about it, then you're going to get less access to kids, or if there are even rumors about it.
Right.
A common thing, also for prison, but quiet is a common piece of it. So, they encouraged Lloyd to take a polygraph, to hold off their bosses, another little trick. He agreed, and that enters the detective that Allison was talking about, Katie Leggett, who took the approach that she believed, Lloyd. She told him she believed him, and that the polygraph would confirm that. And when the results came back with deception, she really switched modes in a gifted way and focused honed in on her disappointment with him. So she was using, it's the yin and the yang. It's the yo-yo, right? I build rapport and connection with you and then show the disappointment. I like to call it the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. And, in his third version, Lloyd told the detectives that he admitted being involved with Molesky and taking the girls over to Molesky's house, and Molesky taking them into the basement, where Lloyd said he heard screams and saw the girls naked.
Are you looking for a new job or want a career change? Look no further than Monster.com. Need a little help standing out? Our expert resume writing services will make sure you shine. Want to brush up on your interview skills? Engage with our AI interview prep tool. Want some advice on negotiating your new salary? Visit our salary tools and extensive library of career advice articles, and you'll have all the tips and tricks you'll need to succeed. Visit Monster.com today and take the first step towards your career. Monster.com. Find your right job fit.
Now, he's placing himself as an accomplice at this point, admitting to being involved with Molesky. In Mark Bowden's book, The Last Stone, he describes this as hours of bullshit, then 5 minutes of half-truth. And I think he nailed it there.
Very much.
Next, the Montgomery County Police announce a connection in the case, eventually. And they call Lloyd a person of interest. This was meant to rattle Lloyd as much as anything else, like getting
because
help.
it put his name in the news, right?
Right.
It was no longer quiet, and they said they put on the news affiliate in the lunchroom or cafeteria, wherever, the common area in the jail, so that the inmates would see it.
The Lord taketh away.
Yeah.
So in the next version, Lloyd inserts his cousin, Billy, and his uncle, Richard, who goes by Dickie, and we'll call him Dick throughout the story. They asked Lloyd, who are you afraid of? Right? Another common investigator trick. Who are you afraid of? And he eventually said he was afraid of his cousin, Teddy Welch. So we got Billy, Richard, who's Dick, and now Teddy. So Lloyd now says that he had seen Teddy beat up people before, and he implied that Teddy had come to his stepmother Edna's house the day the girls disappeared, and Lloyd had seen the girls being drugged and raped. He said that Teddy was the one who, was running it, and somebody that he called, quote, the other guy, were the kidnappers. So Lloyd said he was threatened by them. Lloyd said he was lying about Molesky and that he wasn't the other man. So he said he had never seen the other man before.
It's just amazing the way that his story changes and the way that he lies. And this whole
absurdity of some of the lies. How old is Teddy at this point?
Teddy was like, what, 12 or 13? He was
younger than that. Yeah.
Wasn't he the one that had the casts on his arms? I think we might get to that. Yeah. So that was another detail. This is another kind of scapegoat that Lloyd is throwing at us here. And the way that Welch talks and lies is really key to understanding this interrogation, because too many people that are talking about this case, you might see if you go and look it up on Reddit, the way people are talking about it is they're taking this really reductive view and saying that police, of course, were feeding him this information, that they, based it on moments when Welch, for instance, might fold in a swear word that a detective would use in the course of questioning. But this is something a lot of people do when they're trying to adapt in a group dynamic. I mean, I do it all the time when I visit my family in the South. I automatically start talking like I'm from the South. The twang just comes, But it's something that a grifter might also do to kind of seat themselves in a little better among the people they're trying to con. And that's not the same as feeding information. The detectives, more than anything, were trying to find the right emotional buttons to push so that Welch might feel inclined to open up to them and share something he was holding back. This is not the same thing as leading a witness and making them regurgitate facts that you're feeding them. See the interrogation of Brendan Dassey and Making a Murderer, for instance, although that was eventually overturned and then reinstated by the federal court. But we're not talking about Avery today. But make no mistake, this 22-month-long interrogation was far from perfect. Mark Bowden actually portrayed this really well in The Last Stone, and showing the ways that the police here might have endangered their own case a little bit by making certain promises regarding immunity, because that was the other thing. Lloyd was asking for immunity while claiming he had nothing to do with any of this. So it was a bit of a paradox he was creating there. But, these cops were adapting as they were going as well.
We call that a clue.
Yes, very much a clue. And, and Lloyd would spend hours denying something only to then admit to like a piece of it. And in doing this, he would just end up doing multiple about faces that would give them little pieces of info every single time. He didn't realize that he was sort of shedding information as he was going. It sort of reminds me of like when the ATF and the FBI talk about how they catch bombers, and how a lot of bomb makers and people that use bombs don't realize that it's not that they're eliminating evidence whenever they blow a place up. They are creating mountains of evidence for them, for the police to find them. And so it's sort of like this. The chaos he thought he was creating was only giving them a trail of breadcrumbs to follow.
See, I have a slightly different theory about that. I come from a very long line of liars. I created a giant scandal. I was telling you before that my grandfather once said, or supposedly said, boy, boy, never tell the truth when a lie will do. But one of the things about people who, what we know about sexual offenders, sexually related homicide in particular, but sexually related offenses, is this idea that people get sexual gratification from those offenses. It doesn't necessarily need to be sexual assault, doesn't necessarily need to be homicide. It could be stealing socks out of somebody's drawer. And
Right.
once they're in custody, they can no longer get gratification out of those acts. So lying becomes an excellent substitute for it. And people get a thrill from you going down the rabbit hole. So you've got to lay out some breadcrumbs that people can grab onto to keep your high going. So the alternative possibility is that Lloyd knew he was dropping breadcrumbs because he wanted to keep them coming back so he could fool them. Perhaps
That's a good point. That is not a bad point at all. When you do consider the fact that this is a man who's been locked up in prison, he hasn't been able to get the dopamine rush of crime in quite some time. And of course, nearly every word that he speaks is truth wrapped in a lie, which is coincidentally a very popular definition for fiction. And in his evasion of truth, he just kind of metes out just enough honesty to get himself to the next intersection. And if he hits a dead end, he'll completely change directions like it's the most natural thing in the world and not even acknowledge that anything he'd said previously was a lie or half true. And so it's just this pattern of a lifelong abuser, grifter, street hustler, con man. And yes, he enjoys this. And like I said, I used the word pathos when you and I were talking privately earlier, but that is his bread and butter. He always paints himself as the victim. Per The Last Stone, I just like this direct quote. Lloyd repeated that he always owned up to his crimes by way of arguing that his denials about the Lyon girls should be believed. But his past demonstrated something else. Lloyd would admit a thing only when he had to, after he'd been caught, and only those parts he couldn't refute. All his admissions had been calculated to mitigate his punishment. They were grudging, limited, and laced with denial in every instance. Even his admissions about his molestation charges, he portrayed himself as an innocent victim.
So the detectives interview Lloyd's cousin Teddy and eventually find out a really remarkable story. Teddy's mother had sold him to a notorious area sexual offender named Leonard Kreisel for wall-to-wall carpet and tile in our house. I would find this story odd if I hadn't heard it so many times before, both in my reporting in Appalachia and my mental health work. The number of parents who will not just abuse or neglect their child, but will utilize their child as a tool to get what they want, will flip your head if you visit that dark area. It may be part of the culture, particularly in Appalachia. I have a good friend. Her mother did something very similar to her with her uncle, who was in a relationship with her mom, and that's
wow.
It's the only way he would keep the relationship going on is if he could also have the daughter. So, jumping back to Teddy, over the years, Teddy and his wife maintained a relationship with Kreisel and were living in a house that Kreisel had given Teddy. He was living in it with his family when he was interviewed by detectives. One of Teddy's 3 children disclosed at school to a school counselor later that all 3 siblings had been molested by Kreisel. So that's Teddy's kids.
Wow.
Teddy and his wife, at that point, once they found out about it, did cut Kreisel off. But investigators could find no evidence linking Teddy to the disappearance of the Lyon sisters. And they found out that Teddy had been in an accident about a month before the disappearance and had both arms in casts at the time and was barely capable of getting around. The abuse that Teddy and Lloyd experienced as children, was not an aberration in their clan. It was the norm. Fathers beat and raped their children. Brothers terrorized and raped their sisters and cousins. Alcohol, drugs, violence colored every relationship. By the 1970s, the Klan had two branches, one in Hyattsville, Maryland, and one in Thaxton, Virginia, a place that the locals called Taylor's Mountain. Some of the relatives moved into sort of more modern communities in and around Bedford, but one branch of the family, the Parkers, still lived in Taylor's Mountain. The Maryland branch lived in a remarkably different suburban environment. This country family really lived shoulder to shoulder with city dwellers, strip malls, big retail outlets, and there was enough of them, the Welches, the Overstreets, the Dooleys, the Estepps, the Parkers, to fill a local park for their annual family reunions in Maryland. They may have, different places, but the family was very much the same in the mountain hollers as they were in the city. Suspicion of outsiders, contempt for authority, the poverty, the jump very quickly to violence and the sexual abuse, the incest. And so many of those have become norms in places where social isolation exists. And, all of a sudden these social taboos sort of become integrated, but it's way out of the norms of Hyattsville, which is in Prince George's County, Maryland. Still, criminal behavior in the family rarely led to even internal family censure, much less the authorities getting involved. An important point to hold on to.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean, they all kind of cover for each other in some ways, or just know about things, but they don't snitch on each other.
And there's this great example. One female family member alleged that her Uncle Dick, along with his brothers, including Lloyd's father, were out on the front porch in Hyattsville at one point. And, one uncle told this girl to get on his lap. And when she tried to get up, he pulled her back down onto his lap. A cousin intervened kind of out of nowhere, yelling at his own father and pulling her off, right? And then the cousin took the girl around the side of the house. So this was rare that family censure would happen. But then that cousin who took the girl exposed himself on the other side of the house to her.
Oh, geez. What a fun family to hang out with. It just kind of it does give me that Texas Chainsaw vibe too, in addition to all the other movies we might reference here. But yeah.
The things I don't like about my extended family, I turn around and say I'm blessed when I pay attention to things like this in case.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the detectives began to believe that the Lyon sisters may have fallen into sort of the cesspool of this clan. Teddy's life of abuse seemed to turn his focus into protecting children, while Lloyd's led him to become a sexual predator. Lloyd emerged from the culture of his family, both as a victim himself and also as a predator. We talked earlier about the fact that he had been kicked out by his parents, had been living on the street. He claimed to have experienced sexual abuse. Lloyd strayed from the family's grip, but not from its behaviors. And I think that's an important thing to remember. It's a lot easier. We used to have this saying. I remember this one time I was at the New York Times and I was like whining to one of my colleagues. And I was like, I just need to leave this place and I need to go to some other city. I'll go work for the Los Angeles Times or whoever. And she said, "Oh, you want to go geographic?" And I was like, "Yeah." And she was like, "One problem, Jason. Wherever you go, there you are." So
That is one of my favorite sayings, actually.
yeah, I'd never heard it until the moment, and I was like, so, at this point, Lloyd has not yet implicated Dick or Dick's wife or Aunt Pat or any of the other people in the family. But the detectives found it really curious that after their interview with Teddy, Teddy called Dick and Pat, who he rarely called. And he asked to meet Dick in person, which they found very interesting. And the detectives at this point had a wiretap, a pole camera above the house, and they were tracking Teddy's cell phone location. Teddy said that there was something important and urgent to discuss. And one thing that also happened around this time, a witness named Dee Daner, so they've announced Lloyd's name, saw Lloyd's picture on TV and got in touch with the police. She told them of seeing a suspicious man who looked like Lloyd at Wheaton Plaza that day, a young man with long brown hair and a mustache who scared her. She said the man was staring at her intently, enough so that she looked for a security guard. And one of the I can say, we talk a lot about the downsides of publicity. I will be the first to get on somebody else's podcast to whine about how terrible YouTube creators are and how horrendous the publicity is. But there is an upside to publicity in cases. People come out of the woodwork.
Oh, yeah.
I think we'll see in some of these upcoming cases like Delphi, Idaho. Right now, I think we're seeing a lot of the downside. I suspect when we see the witness lists in those cases, we're going to have a number of people who came forward with things because of things that they heard in the news. So this
Very
is
much. It just creates more work for the investigators ultimately.
No, it's not a downside to it, right? Because they
right.
overwhelmed by information, but sometimes you can get nuggets.
But you want that info. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, on April 24th, 2014, Lloyd gives his fifth version of the story. He acknowledges a lot of what he had said had been a lie. Lloyd said that Teddy and Kreisel had disappeared for a while when they were hanging out. So he's incorporating Kreisel into it now and came back in a Camaro. He said he used to go party at Kreisel's house where they had those the sex parties with the minors all the time, and he remembered seeing two blonde girls, and he left. He said it was it was somewhere in the days after the girls disappeared. He described the girls' clothing in this version, and it was spot on. It was exactly what they were wearing.
Oh, that's interesting too.
Mm-hmm. And the pictures didn't show all of it. So later, they got a sixth version. The detectives noted that Teddy was 12 or 11 at the time of the disappearance, and Lloyd altered his story to say that Teddy's dad and Lloyd were in the car with the girls with his uncle, and some other man was driving. This time, Lloyd said the girls came up to him and asked him to take a picture of them. Dick was in the car. Teddy convinced him to go to the car. Lloyd said he and Dick dropped them off at a store on Route 1, which was Baltimore Avenue, and never saw the girls again. Then we got the seventh version. Lloyd
keeps stepping up to the plate and taking a swing.
Lying. I find it so amazing looking at the videos of the lying. It's not like when he gets caught in a lie, like most people will, like your good old narcissist will like try to gaslight you and be like, but what I said was and you're interpreting it wrong or whatever. Or other people will be embarrassed. Lloyd is just like, yep, I lied, and moves along. So to the seventh version, Lloyd places himself with the girls as they left the mall in a car with his uncle and his cousin. And he now is going in the opposite direction. In this version, Lloyd says he was not dropped off, but when he went to the house, he saw Dick sexually assaulting the girls in the basement. Lloyd speculated that Dick kept the girls locked up in his basement for a week in a space that the cousins all corroborated that nobody else was allowed to go into.
And so many different stories, so many confessions. And, we we want to talk a little bit about how confessions can be unreliable, because at this point we're hearing all sorts of lies. Our listener Jessica here, Just the Facts True Crime Research, said Casey Anthony vibes. Very much so. Very similar class of liar. And confessions are really only as good as the techniques used to derive them in many cases, I believe. We already mentioned how, uh, we've already talked about torture, studies done on enhanced interrogation techniques like waterboarding, discussion we were all having during the War on Terror years. And there is a line where you can't really trust the information derived from a person in deep pain or distress because they'll say anything to make the torture stop. This is, again, why the rapport building that Jason mentioned is so important. And while the police here really towed the line, they talked about how when Lloyd was most tired and ready to tap out, that was when he would offer them a different piece of information. So he made it a practice to keep him on the weary side. But did you have something you needed to say about that?
I was just going to jump in with a point here, sort of like touching on what you said in the beginning about interrogation techniques, because I think that is a really important point to emphasize. So we're constantly hearing sometimes in cases where the police have charged someone and someone else confessed to the crime. When you get a confession, you want a couple things, right? You want to have some holdback evidence, right? Things that people don't know. And you want the person confessing to bring it up on their own. And you want corroboration. So for example, if someone were to confess to something like the Delphi murders, I was on the bridge and this happened and this happened and this happened, and I saw this truck and that's in my confession. Then you go get the other guy who was driving the truck, and then you have this piece of corroboration that nobody else had. So that's kind of what you want. And the same thing when I've done corporate investigations, we're sitting at the table and we're holding back a bunch of stuff that we know, and we're asking the person questions. And we're waiting for the person who tells us something we know that we haven't brought up. And so I just want to say corroboration and holdback are key to getting good confession.
So very true. And yeah, it gives you an ability to completely write off something. That's interesting too, because even just reading about this particular interrogation, it's interesting how they didn't have a lot to hold back. So really Lloyd was just giving them those breadcrumbs. But they were able to corroborate it. And it was independently corroborated by the family themselves, which we will get into. But, they puffed up his ego as much as they could. They reminded him that he was a good guy. I think I read that phrase ad nauseum throughout it. And I could imagine that they themselves wanted to throw up in their mouths every time that they would say this to him. And, saying that, you're capable of doing the right thing, but, things really...
Having hung out with a bunch of detectives, they went into the other room and laughed at themselves.
Man, I don't know. Sometimes, I would just say, there were some things that he said that just, oof. I'm not a cop for a reason, though. But, things really picked up again when Katie Leggett came in because, she was going to administer this second polygraph. And I think the documentary made mention of the fact that, bringing this polygraph machine into the prison was kind of a challenge, a logistical challenge for them to even do. But he wanted to take the polygraph to clear his own name, which again, you'll see criminals thinking that makes them look more innocent. But if you're a narcissist, you already think that you're going to beat the polygraph. And of course,
and also, if you're not an idiot, you realize that the polygraph machine is just meant to trick you. That's the whole point of it.
Yeah. And, Katie here, she really knew how to use that as the investigative tool that it is meant to be. This little bit of sort of trickery to kind of to see if you can convince someone to confessing, after they've been found to be deceptive. And that's ultimately what happens. She puts on this whole act and makes herself kind of look like this dumb little woman that doesn't know how to work the machine. And, she's like, oh, geez, it's breaking again. Oh, and so she's doing this whole act. It was pretty great. And of course, he's kind of fallen into it because he's becoming a little charmed by her. And that was, though, like, as they're talking, and then she finds out that he's lied, or that he failed the polygraph. Then she comes in and said, "You know what? I stuck my neck out for you. I did all this, and I thought we really had something." And she's really getting in his face about it at this point. Um, and also, then she finally was just like, as she was trying to burrow into what could get him to finally open up and find that sort of emotional fulcrum to lean on, is, saying, well, maybe you had stumbled onto something so horrific, that even you're afraid to admit what you saw. And then that was probably the one little bit of bait that he picked up, because then his story sort of changed again after that. And it broadened about, like, who he saw and what he saw and who he was with. And of course, it involved a lot of his family members, many of whom the police hadn't really met or talked to yet. And they would later, of course, like I said, corroborate a lot of these highly incriminating things.
Yeah. So this sort of gets us to August of that year. And at that point, the detectives are getting, super, super suspicious about things. And they take a trip to Taylor's Mountain, to the house and the property owned by Lizzie Parker, Lloyd's aunt, and sister to his father, Lee and Dick. For those of you who are with us live, if you take a look, these are some of the key locations in the beginning. You've got Wheaton Plaza, the Loyns' home, the home that Lloyd was staying at on Baltimore Avenue down in the bottom right. And this gives you an idea of how far Taylor's Mountain is down into Appalachia.
It's pretty far out, looking at this map. I mean, it's well removed from that cluster of city,
Yeah.
up there.
And so when they get there, a neighbor mentions a graveyard up on a hill. And the police find a graveyard with 30 markers. And the police got wiretaps on a lot of family members, found some cooperators in the family, targeted the cell phones of Dick, Teddy, Pat, placed a camera on that telephone pole outside of Dick and Pat's house. And in a key moment, one relative calls Pat and said police were digging up on the mountain, and noted that she feared, quote, they were going to find those girls. But Pat said they were digging in the wrong place. Things not to say when you're being wiretapped. So
Yeah.
Dick and Pat had been making in-person trips to Virginia and other locations to tell family members that their phones had been tapped, because they had sort of figured it out. Regardless of whether there was a family conspiracy in 1975, there was one now. The police searched Dick and Pat's house and didn't find any evidence. The police held another press conference and named Dick as a second person of interest. At the same time, investigators were still interviewing Lloyd. They were working as family. So Lloyd had gone on after 1975 to get in a lot of trouble, but remained relatively free. In 1992 in South Carolina, a 10-year-old girl who had been staying with him, was watching a horror movie with him, became frightened, got into bed with Lloyd. It's a pretty normal thing that kids do when they're scared, right? They expect that us as the adults around are a safe haven wherever they are. And if they need a hug, or they need to hold on us, or they need to sleep in the bed with us, it's a pretty normal thing.
Right.
But this girl awoke and said she found Lloyd molesting her. In 1994, Lloyd pleaded guilty to and was sentenced to 18 months in jail. 3 years later in Delaware, Lloyd had started playing pornographic movies in front of a 10-year-old girl. That girl said he sexually abused her for more than a week after that. He pleaded guilty to that, and that's how he got the long sentence in Delaware. The similarities to the Lyon sisters stands out. Their ages, right? It wasn't stranger abductions, but their ages. So there's no question, by the way, by the time we get to 2014, or 2011, even before the case is open, some of his family members had suspicions. And right around this time, as the detectives are discovering this, then came the 8th version from Lloyd.
8th or 9th or 10th. I mean, man, yeah, so many.
So the detectives had talked to Connie. She was Connie Parker. I think she was Connie Akers by the time that happened. And she was a cousin who had mentioned Lloyd appearing with Helen in the duffel bag, filled with what he had said told her was rotten hamburger meat. She said that Helen was pregnant and the visit was in the spring of 1975. Connie, as a reminder, led them to her estranged brother, Henry Parker, who said he had been with her when Lloyd and Helen arrived with the bloody duffel bag. And they had not come on foot, as Connie remembered, but in a green or yellow station wagon that belonged to Dick. The police discovered that Helen and Lloyd left in another car and that the station wagon never made its way, left to go back in another car, and that the station wagon never made it off the mountain. Both Connie and Henry both recalled Lloyd placing the duffel bag between all four of them, but Henry remembered him saying that it was a dead dog, not hamburger meat. Henry and Connie remembered the duffel bag being packed up enough to sit up on its own, on its side. And later, Lloyd had made a comment about transmission fluid potentially having spilled. Connie said Lloyd opened the duffel bag and she saw bloody clothes on top of it. Henry didn't remember him opening it, but they both remember how bad it smelled. The police had intercepted a Facebook Messenger message where Connie had said to another cousin that she feared Henry, her brother, was involved in helping bury the girls. But Henry said he was only involved in throwing the bag on the fire that burned for more than a week. Later in grand jury testimony, Henry speculated that Lloyd might have killed one of the girls with a tire iron on the drive down to Taylor's Mountain. I want you to hold on to that tire iron. Later, police played parts of Lloyd's statements to Connie and to Henry, where Lloyd now said that Dick and Henry had brought the bag and thrown it onto the fire. Henry gave even more details at this point about the duffel bag, down to its green color and it being cinched at the top with drawstrings. He admitted to helping Lloyd throw it in the fire, and they recalled Lloyd arriving at about 6:30 a.m. So think about that, a 5-hour drive from Hyattsville. That would have placed him leaving at like 1:30 a.m. So detectives made up a story with Lloyd about Helen, who I'd mentioned had died, having
a journal.
Yeah, and it worked. It worked.
Oh, it did. It really did. And his face in the video of the interrogation, when they revealed that she had journals, his face completely froze. It was, he was like, oh, great. Now I have to switch gears again.
You're not bad liars themselves, those detectives. So Teddy had described at this point, he's been interviewed several times, a recovered memory of going to Lloyd's parents around the time of the disappearance and hearing Helen talk about babysitting girls and hearing something in the attic, right? There was an attic with a mattress in the closet, a pool table, and he remembered seeing 2 young girls sitting there. In this new version by Lloyd that happens after the Teddy interview, Lloyd says he remembers the moment that the 2 girls were there, but they weren't the Lyon sisters. He thinks they were family members. Lloyd said he was going to tell the detectives everything, and he said that on March 23rd, Dick, who was a security guard near Wheaton Plaza, approached him and Teddy with a plan to go to Wheaton Plaza to pick up a couple of girls to party with. Lloyd said that nope, he wasn't going to do it because he was dating Helen and he wasn't interested in picking up girls and she was pregnant. And Lloyd said that instead he and Helen got high, which I find interesting with your pregnant girlfriend as bed.
Right.
Yep. Okay. Anyway, so in this version, Lloyd said that he approached the 2 girls.
It was the 70s.
Right. Yeah. I don't think it was about the 70s, my friend. So in this version, the newest version, Lloyd says he approaches the 2 girls, offers them the opportunity to get high, and they both get in the car. Lloyd put himself in the front seat this time and said Sheila seemed excited about getting high, and Katherine at some point started to cry. He said that he and Helen agreed to babysit the girls for Dick. So in a search of the mountain, the investigators turned up a part of a wire frame that could have been a part of the glasses that Sheila wore. and beads that might have been a part of a necklace that Katherine was wearing on the day she disappeared.
It was some of the only physical evidence they found up there.
Yeah, yeah. And so in 2017, investigators at Taylor's Mountain discovered a tooth, which was judged on site to be that of a human and belonging to a child of 12 years old. I don't know who judged it. I'm sure they didn't have a forensic dentist on site, although I don't know. It was tagged and bagged and sent to the Bedford County Sheriff's Office. When the cold case team went to get it the next day to send it to the lab, it was gone. Nobody knows what happened to it.
That's so frustrating. Probably the most frustrating part of this case. Yeah.
So in the summer of 2014, the detectives had an interview with another Welch cousin, Wes Justice, who was about 10 years younger than Lloyd. So he would have been about 8 around the time that the murders happened. And at first, Wes, too, denied knowing anything about the murders other than what he had read in news publications. In wiretaps earlier, though, in a conversation between Wes and his cousin, Norma Jean Welch, Wes had said, and the police had learned, that he had told her he was worried about a, quote, green station wagon that had been used to carry the girls. And that was the first the investigators had heard of it. When investigators asked him about the green station wagon, he broke down sobbing and said he did have relevant information. At first, Wes said he was unsure of the details until one cold case detective used one of the oldest tricks in the books in referring to Katherine and Sheila's parents and pointed to Wes's grandchildren who were in the other room and said, "Can you imagine those 2 beautiful young kids you got there? They know," talking about the Lyon parents, "they know their kids got raped and murdered." And investigators brought a copy of what they said was Dick's grand jury testimony. It was not true. It was a bluff. And said that he had talked in detail about the case. This all caused Wes to open up. And he said he remembered talking to Uncle Dick about the Lyon sisters' case relatively recently. And his uncle had come out and told him that he had raped those girls. Wes said Dick had mentioned the station wagon just a few months before. Eventually, Wes later told the Bedford County, Virginia grand jury that was investigating it that Dick, quote, just hopped up out of the blue about the station wagon up in the mountains in a barn. And he said it was covered up. And I think he said there were blankets in the back of it. Wes told investigators that Dick said he and his brother, Lloyd's father, Lee, were involved with raping the girls. Wes said that he was told that Lloyd lured the girls from Wheaton Plaza and then they were raped repeatedly on a pool table in Dick's house before being killed. Then he said he was told they were taken to Taylor's Mountain in a green station wagon, and the car had been hidden in a barn that was falling apart on the property. He said Dick wanted to go up to the mountain and smash the car after the renewed investigation began. And Wes's cousin, who I had mentioned before, Norma Jean Welch, told about hearing a similar story on the wiretap.
It's amazing that they didn't. It just shows how isolated and detached from regular society that they are, that this car had sat in that barn for decades because they had no worry or they had no concern. It's amazing that they didn't dispose of it right away. Yep. It takes a level of brazenness, I think, to do something like that.
Well, and it also speaks to the isolation and the ownership. Remember, the deputies were afraid to go up to the mountain.
True. They knew they were kind of immune up there to observation in a lot of ways, scrutiny.
And so, Wes said that Dick had told him about how the girls had been lured by Lloyd from Wheaton Plaza. And he said something curious in this part of the story. And it tied back to something curious that Lloyd had said to the detectives. He said, "I understand something. You're right. Something terrible happened. Cut them up, burn them or something." And the cold case detectives later told Mark Bowden, who's the author of The Last Stone, that they couldn't help but noticing, a lot like his cousin Lloyd, it was hard to wring a story out of Wes. But after they did, it was hard to tell how much was true. But these 2 references to burning.
Yes.
And so on May 1, 2015, Lloyd's interviewed again, and he now says he didn't know He did not know the girls were at his uncle's house when he made the initial report, but he had seen them there at his uncle's house and thought they were runaways. He stuck up to the rest of his last story, saying Dick drove up at night with the duffel bag and told them about the fire and the horrible odor. Lloyd speculated that Dick had killed them under a bridge in Hyattsville where he used to go fishing. And so the detectives go to this bridge and discover basically it's exposed. The water is low, terrible place for fishing. Everybody could see everything. And they were really disheartened because they were hoping to find some kind of physical evidence. But on the way back to the office, Detective Humrick recognizes this house from the files. It's Lee and Edna's house at 4714 Baltimore Avenue. And
we mentioned that address way at the beginning.
And so the detective convinces the current owners to let him in and search the basement, and the basement matched Lloyd's description. One of the things that Lloyd had said in his interviews was that the basement had a backdoor entrance with a certain kind of cove in it. And, this is 4714 Baltimore Avenue, and that absolutely matched the description. Now, in Lloyd's story, he described it as his Uncle Dick's house, but it matched the description of his parents' house.
Yeah, another one of those things of where I'm going to tell you the truth that there was a house. He's just giving a different house, sort of like I saw a man at the mall with the girls. But it's he's just picking a different man, but it was really him,
Yeah, it goes back to the thing I was saying about lying, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're going to lie about something and lie about something big, like it happened at Dick's house and not my house, you're not going to, you may reach for other details that are very similar. And I think to some extent, that's probably what happened with the bridge and the fishing. He reached for a detail near where it really happened,
Right.
So your mind goes to the truth. It jumps off of the truth to find the lie. And that's part of the reason why the truth is often very close. If you flip the prism, if you play with the Rubik's Cube a little bit, it's very close.
Rubik's Cube. No.
So the detectives are able to convince those owners to go into the house and do a search of the basement. Totally matches Lloyd's description. Forensic technicians go in and spray the basement with a chemical called Blue Star, which is used to detect blood by binding with hemoglobin, and the basement lit up.
Big time.
Not just in spots and on pipes. Blue Star, it's relevant because Blue Star can give false positives for certain minerals like magnesium, but it was in strings across the walls, in puddles, on the ceiling, everywhere. And the detectives wanted to have the entire wall taken out to be tested, which proved a little bit impractical. So they had portions of the cement blocks pulverized and sent to the lab. That material was later tested and found it to include hemoglobin. And that's the protein containing iron that facilitates the transport of oxygen in red blood cells. It's almost all vertebrates, except for one kind of fish, have hemoglobin. But they believed that this was human. The hemoglobin ultimately was too degraded to find a match for blood type or to find DNA. But they had a pretty good idea right now. Something terrible happened in that basement connected to them.
Yeah, and there's a possibility, as always, that technology could evolve to a place to where they might be able to test this better. Who knows? We're hearing about cases like this all the time. Othram, exactly. In Idaho, and then you hear the cases being referred to with the West Memphis 3 and, the shoelaces and things like that, and that they don't want to have to test these things and destroy them. So, because that's kind of what the risk is right now. So we just kind of sit on a lot of this stuff and wait for science to catch up.
Yeah. And I don't think they're going to have any shortage, though, because they can always go back to those walls. So this brings us to Lloyd's final version. Lloyd talked about the search of Baltimore Avenue home with the detectives and said, quote, "They found blood down there?" And he said he was referring to Sheila. They said yes, which was not exactly true because they had just found the hemoglobin. Lloyd changes his story at this point from it being at Dick's house to it being at his father's house. Lloyd said he was a part of abducting the girls, that he didn't rape them, that it was orchestrated by Dick, that his father Lee was there, participated in the rapes, and that they were filmed for child pornography, and that Dick broke Katherine's neck out of frustration because she was crying. Remember, he said she had been crying before, too, in the car. And that they chopped them up with a long arm axe that was hard to wield and hit the ceiling. So Lloyd made two small alterations to that story during that interview, saying he didn't participate in chopping Katherine up, but took one swing, and then changed the story to his father Lee strangling Katherine as she laid in the basement floor and breaking her neck, and Dick chopping them up. He said they used old rugs and blankets to soak up the blood and stuffed everything into a bag with pieces of Katherine's body. He said he took them to Taylor's Mountain out of fear that he would be cut up too. The murder weapon had changed from an axe at this point to a hatchet. He told a different story than Wes, right? He said he had driven a 1965 Chrysler New Yorker belonging to his Aunt Pat's father. He said Dick had given him $40 for gas. He said he was worried that if he stopped, blood might leak out of the trunk. So he said he made the trip straight. He said he arrived back at 4714 Baltimore Avenue at daybreak, showered, slept. He said a few days later, he and Helen hitchhiked back down to Taylor's Mountain. He said he didn't know what happened to Sheila. Some law enforcement speculated that she was killed in Maryland. Others thought she could have been taken to the mountain and killed there. The case was seen as stronger in Virginia, and Virginia was a death penalty state. So the detectives asked Lloyd why he brought Teddy into the story, and he simply said, scapegoat.
So many scapegoats in his stories.
And one of the things I want to throw out, we've got no bodies at this point.
Still no body.
And no body homicides are difficult. I remember in 1998, when I was a reporter at the Times, I covered the case of Kenneth and Sante Kimes. You know, Kenneth, his mother Sante, were living in this Upper East Side mansion. And a woman named Irene Silverman owned it. She was like an 82-year-old socialite, former ballerina. And Kenneth was a tenant in one of Silverman's apartments and came under suspicion once she disappeared because he had used an alias to get the apartment. And on the day that she disappeared, the police actually arrested Sante and Kenneth on a fraud check charge in another state. They really suspected them. And this was one of the first, I think it was the first no-body homicide case, no DNA in New York history. So it is super rare to solve a no-body homicide case. And that's part of why the focus is on this piece.
Yeah. And, I think these no-body cases, again, they seem to mostly bother people who really struggle with the idea of circumstantial evidence and what that means. They hear that word and immediately think flimsy evidence. And, a murder case without a body, it requires a lot more inference and deduction and footwork and, piecing together the most random of, pieces to see how they fit. And, people who think DNA and fingerprints, which are also circumstantial evidence in that category, they believe that they think those things are the only path to the truth of who done it. And they don't usually feel comfortable doing that, harder work of separating the wheat from the chaff. It's hard. I think we humans are sort of programmed to want to take that shortcut. And, DNA is a great shortcut to go and like, oh, we found them. So when you don't have a body and you don't have the DNA and you have to piece together all these other things, it's a lot more work, but you'll still get the picture.
So this takes us to, I think, July 14, 2015. Lloyd Lee Welch is indicted for capital murder by the Commonwealth of Virginia. He had the potential of being sentenced to death. They wanted to leverage that to see if they could get closer to the truth. After Lloyd's indicted, the prosecution filed the names of 10 women who were willing to testify that they were attacked were nearly kidnapped by him. Two women told detectives that they got into Welch's vehicle near Wheaton Plaza sometime near the spring of 1975, but according to court documents, quote, seeking danger or sensing danger, they attempted to exit the vehicle. However, the door handles were inoperable, and they were forced to roll down the windows to escape to avoid abduction. Another woman alleged in 1985, 10 years after Sheila and Katherine disappeared, Lloyd and his then girlfriend were living in North Carolina in a trailer park, and he started a sexual relationship with a 15-year-old girl who lived there. After getting caught, the woman claimed Lloyd beat the girl. Around the same time, the person said Lloyd kicked his girlfriend, who was pregnant, in the stomach, sending her into premature labor. In the end, 4 people implicated Lloyd Lee Welch. Himself, Teddy, who told detectives that he saw the 2 young blonde girls at his Uncle Dick's house on Easter Sunday with Lloyd and his girlfriend Helen. Wes, Justice, said that Richard or Dick Welch confided in him and that several family members raped, murdered, chopped up, and then burned Sheila and Katherine. Lloyd made a plea deal where he admitted to participating in the girls' abduction, but not their sexual assault and murder. He pled guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. They had to use the statute that was in place in 1975, and at that point, Virginia didn't have a felony murder charge, which is, so he had to actually plea to killing them. Beyond speaking to enter the plea, Lloyd refused to allocute to any of the details. Katherine and Sheila's parents were at the hearing. Lloyd received 2 concurrent 48-year sentences, plus a few years later, a concurrent 12-year sentence related to 2 sexual assaults he admitted to committing in Manassas, Virginia. Lloyd will be transferred to Virginia in 2026. I look forward to saying hi. Once he completes his sentence in Delaware. This is the oldest no-body homicide case solved in the United States. He'll be eligible for parole in his 80s, but authorities say there is slim to no chance of that happening. Edna, his stepmom, was charged with perjury for providing false testimony and was accused of passing false information to investigators and encouraging a conspiracy of silence within her family. Leslie Inkling, Dick Welch's brother-in-law, was charged with felony perjury. Amy Welch Johnson, Dick's granddaughter, was charged with obstruction of justice, a misdemeanor. Gladys Stange, Dick's sister, was also charged with obstruction of justice. Each was accused of misleading a Bedford County, Virginia grand jury. Leslie, who lived in the Washington suburb of Alexandria, Virginia, was convicted of perjury and sentenced to 5 years in prison, with 5 suspended and placed on probation. Amy, who lived in a bedroom community in Severn, Maryland, had her charges dismissed, and so did Gladys, who lived in Bedford near Taylor's Mountain. Lloyd's Lee father had a history of child abuse and rape, according to the family, but he died after moving to Tennessee, and his widow, Edna, was hostile and unhelpful. Whether or not Lee had broken Katherine's neck and taken any part of the outrages was moot. His destiny had been sealed. Dick was not charged. The prosecutors could not make the case against him, and some of the prosecutors thought Dick had nothing to do with the crime. A few months before Lloyd's trial was to begin, Patricia Ann Welch, his cousin, and his uncle Dick's daughter told Washington's NBC affiliate and WTOP radio that, quote, "I just think there's a really big cover-up in Bedford. It may have started on Montgomery County, but it ended there." Pat said she believed her own father, Dick, was not responsible for the murders. In 2020, Detective Humrock, speaking to a Fox News reporter about the case and the conviction of Lloyd Lee Welch, told a reporter, quote, "Even though we got a conviction, we still don't really consider this a success," adding, "There are some open questions that we never really got answers for. We never really found the remains, which we wanted to bring home to the families. We can only really speculate about what happened to those girls the last day they were alive." Now, we're going to jump to our theories.
Yeah, man. This is heavy. I mean, it's interesting to see how many members of this family eventually went down in some way, shape, or form due to this case. Um, and in that, I would say, justice is hard to come by in this one, full justice, but they did the best they could. So as for theories, I elected to go first. Jason and I have not discussed this amongst ourselves. I have no idea what your theory is, Jason. So we'll see where we diverge and where we converge. It'll be fun. Now, as most of you know, I'm not a cop. I'm not a journalist. I'm not a criminal profiler or a psychologist. I'm just an author. But 99% of the work involved in constructing a compelling story is understanding the way humans behave and the logic, such as it is, behind their choices. And you remember that TV show Castle? I swear it is like a fiction writer's fantasy because similar to detectives, storytellers sort of examine a scene and the people in it from every angle in order to find the best explanation for what happened. And I've been thinking like this for the last 2 decades of my life. So I hope this lends itself well. I don't normally get into true crime theory too much. So, but this story is rare. And because it's anything but dull, it's like this gothic winding thing with a lot of dark corners. Um, let's see. So, like, I don't think it takes any special insight to see that Lloyd Lee Welch was involved in the kidnapping and murder of Kate and Sheila Lyon. Given his proclivities for young girls, as exhibited by all the molestation charges, his known penchant for abandoning one girlfriend for another once he impregnated her or she edged too far beyond the age of consent, I firmly believe he also raped them. Why else would he have kidnapped them in the first place? It wasn't to have a harmless tea party in his daddy's basement. He would never admit to that, of course. For some reason, he never fully admitted to his other sexual assaults against children, calling them accidental touches or, quote, slipping in a finger, as he admitted in the course of one interview, like it was something everyone did. When he says repeatedly throughout his interrogations, "I'd never hurt anyone like that," these are lies, because he did hurt someone like that. A lot of someone's. And many of them lived to tell the tale of his abuse and faced him in court. Lloyd Lee Welch is, at bare minimum, a predatory pedophile drifter, a low-rent Carl Panzeram who should never be out in free society ever again, and thankfully he won't be. On that day in Wheaton Plaza, Welch was on the prowl. Those who witnessed him described a man who was leering or staring intently at the girls, but how did he convince Kate and Sheila to come along with him? The way he tells it, he or one of his cousins or whatever offered them a chance to get high. And maybe he actually did make that offer, but I don't think that would have enticed a couple of young innocents like these, even if they were edging into that more rebellious phase of life. So having failed at that, he wasn't going to give up. No way, not a con man with 2 perfect fish on the hook. He would have to try something else. I think it could have been one of 2 things. Maybe he offered the girls a ride home. Perhaps Sheila had said she needed to get back soon to run her paper route. "Well, heck, I can get you back home a lot quicker," he might have said. And if Lloyd's girlfriend, Helen, was indeed with him, as he claims that day, the presence of a woman might have mollified the sisters just enough to take him up on that offer. And remember, this is still only 1975. Not all the trust in our fellow humans had faded into the guarded cynicism of the 80s just yet. And remember, Lloyd was a talker, a con man, a carny. His only gift in life has been his ability to work young, vulnerable people into doing what he wants. So another possibility is that if the girls didn't take him up on his offer of a ride, he followed them as they left and grabbed them by force somehow along their route home. It was only a couple miles, but I'm sure there was a stretch along there where he could act without being seen. He never needed an accomplice to be successful at this, but Lloyd did always seem to be hanging out with people. So it just seems to fit more that someone tagged along and helped out. But some people out there have claimed that Lloyd, being only 18, seems a little young for a crime so brazen. But I would argue that when you're already an antisocial type like Welch and not particularly bright, youth, with all of its natural impulsivity, can further embolden someone with certain tendencies. We're now living through the age of the school shooter. So I think we can all agree that teenagers are quite capable of murder. And I don't think that's a new thing. From war to the Wild West, history is riddled with stories of murderous kids. You'll learn about many of them here. And remember, there are some very similar, still unsolved cases involving young girls in places that Welch's carnival was known to stop. So it's likely that day at the mall was not his first rodeo at kidnapping. It just so happens to be the one that caught the most attention. So, how else did these other characters get involved? Maybe I'm using more artistic license here, but bear with me. Given the pedophilic, incestuous nature of this family and the difficult relationship Lloyd had with his father, I see this as an act he did to please them, perhaps. Bring a couple girls back for them to all play with. Maybe Daddy and stepmom Edna would let him and his pregnant girlfriend have a place to stay for a while, at least until the desire to get back to the drifter life overtook him again. But this was a family affair. I fully believe this. Many in that clan knew, or at least suspected, that Lloyd had something to do with this. His cousin Henry helped him with the bloody duffel bag. Another cousin helped him wash the blood from his clothes. The wiretaps caught family members talking feverishly about it many decades later, like something that had only happened a month ago. And this isn't some long buried family secret gradually working its way back to the surface. Oh no. It has always been front and center for them. It is stuck in their minds. They have undoubtedly passed that knowledge down to the younger generations like a terrible heirloom, and they'll keep passing it down. That's how this family works. But this case is rife with so many red herrings, right? That's to be expected too, given the sprawling family shrub involved here. But it's also common when a crime happens in a place that's highly public, like a shopping mall. The tape recorder man, for instance, is a prime example of this. There are always going to be people and places doing things that seem strange in hindsight when something bad occurs. And a man with a microphone approaching kids just sticks out. But that lead went nowhere. And even though others reported seeing him, the guy vanished like a fart in the breeze, which, hey, people do. But given the testimony of the Welch clan, I think it's easy to write this guy off as a main character in someone else's story. But what about Ray Molesky, the career criminal and pedophile who was a known figure around the area? And in that family social circle, he probably had direct knowledge of word of mouth as to what happened with the girls. And he would use that knowledge to taunt cops for years because it gave him joy to do so. One of the only things most criminal types are united by is their disdain for authority and their code to never snitch on each other. Ray was already dead by the time Lloyd was on the hot seat in 2014 or, whatever year it was. But word would still get out to people who know people in those weird pedophile circles he ran in, some who might be in prison with Lloyd, for instance. And those people would know Lloyd was lying. Perhaps he was worried about retaliation. This explains why Lloyd refused to implicate him, despite being given multiple opportunities by the police to do so. Remember, most of them were eager and ready to pin this on Molesky from the start, and it was one of the few things Lloyd refused to yield on. It's, if nothing else, a strange show of loyalty for a man who shared a lot of selfish interests with the guy. And for those who would argue that the police merely fed Welch info so that he could regurgitate it back to them, the real bait was right there the whole time. If the case had ended with a dead Ray Molesky being found responsible and I'd watched back the interrogation tapes, I might feel like they walked him into that. But that's not what happened because Lloyd was leading them with facts they had not previously known. And I also wouldn't doubt that Welch and Molesky had done some pretty awful things together in the past. We already knew they ran together, smoked dope together, diddled other kids together. That said, when it comes to the Lyon sisters, I stand by Molesky being, if anything, a bit player in all this. He probably heard all about what went down in the basement in Taylor's Mountain, probably wished he'd been there. Hell, maybe he even was there Who knows? Jason might have a detail on that I've missed. I'm looking forward to hearing it. But for now, I still see him as more of a pink herring rather than a red one. But again, this is a family affair. There will always be lingering questions about the sequence of events that went down that day and the weeks that followed. How long the girls lived after they were taken, how they died, where their remains rest. But those details will forever be lost in the labyrinth of time and drug-addled depravity that has wound its way through much of this family's history for half a century or more. Lloyd Welch can meander his way around the truth all he wants, obscuring the finer details that implicate him in the most horrific deeds one can inflict on another. But we know that's his MO. He rents responsibility like a cheap Fleabag motel room where he'll lie his head for a little bit, but quickly move on. Its memory faded into the tapestry of broken lives that will be his only legacy. The end.
Woo! Take a breath next time.
Woo!
So I like that. I like the Molesky thing and the point that you made about him being unwilling to implicate him. I tend to think that Lloyd just hated his family. So I think that is a good piece of
This is where being the fiction writer comes in, because like I said, I'm going for drama. But
I love this too. So I'll go with mine. So, a metaphor that people use when they talk about circumstantial evidence is that you go to sleep at night and there's no snow on the ground, and you wake up and the ground around you is covered with snow. Now, you can assume probably that it snowed. Now, someone could have put a snow machine outside your window, but the odds of that are relatively low. And there's a lot of circumstantial evidence tying Lloyd Lee Welch to the case. You have the direct evidence, the physical evidence, and the confessions. They're a little bit weaker, but they surely line up with the circumstantial evidence that was collected. The reality is, in life, indirect circumstantial evidence is often stronger than direct evidence. But we have the confessions, the details from Lloyd, Henry Parker, Connie Parker that line up with the trip to Taylor's Mountain. We have the timing of Helen's pregnancy, Dick Welch's statements to West Justice. We have Teddy remembering two blonde girls at a pool table at Dick's house. We have the hemoglobin in the basement at Baltimore Avenue, the tooth found on Taylor's Mountain, and the beads and the wireframes. We have the smell of the fire, and we have evidence of other bad acts, lots of arrests and some convictions for sexual assaults by Lloyd and some damning allegations of sexual abuse against other male family members. When it comes to Lloyd's confessions, I kind of throw out everything that's not corroborated by other evidence. My friend, Julia Cali, former FBI profiler and host of The Consult, we talk about this concept of the duper's delight, where even when suspects are caught dead to rights, particularly in sexually motivated crimes, they get a thrill from deceiving people and sending them down rabbit holes. In psychology, we would consider this a form of substitution, where a captured person can no longer get that gratification they're looking for from sexual crimes because they're incarcerated, so they get that gratification from lying. And when people lie, they tend to lie about the big things, but it takes a lot of energy to lie about the small details. So often big lies come wrapped in the truth. For Lloyd, he talks about the description of how the girls could have been abducted, but creates another suspect matching the news reports. He mentions the girls were probably burned out of nowhere before implicating himself. He talks about the girls being at his uncle's house and being killed under a bridge that's only blocks away from his father's house, where he also lived, and not his uncle's home, where detectives at his father's house found a bloodbath. Like most lies, he probably thought of the truth, made the association between the two locations, and told the tall tale. The truth is always slightly adjacent to what Lloyd says. The other direct and indirect evidence fills in the gaps. There's a porn ring theory, and I compare that to the Odinist theory in Delphi. There may have been a porn ring. In one of Lloyd's confessions, he talks about Dick having a camera. Dick had showed homemade porn movies at Lizzie Parker's house on Taylor's Mountain, came out in grand jury testimony, and Dick acknowledged it. The detectives asked Lloyd whether there was any connection between the porn films, and he said yes, that he thought that they were, on Easter, they were drugged up because he was planning to do porn with them. It's the only potential Molesky connection for me. But you can't trust Lloyd, and there's no evidence that he's correct on that. There's evidence that suggests from what Lloyd said and what Teddy said was that the girls survived at least until May 30th, Easter Sunday. On the porn ring, Lloyd is also a selfish man, and if he wasn't involved in a porn ring, I don't think he was going to go down for it if he wasn't involved. They're lone wolf theories, but Lloyd's history of later sexual abuse without murder is there, and he was generally incompetent when it came to getting caught. And the fact that he didn't get caught for so long after getting caught for so many other crimes, like, it kind of leads me to believe that other people were involved. So Lloyd settled on the story that his uncle killed Katherine by breaking her neck and then dismembering her. In one version, Lloyd says he took a swing at Katherine with an axe and stopped because he couldn't do it, and his Uncle Dick finished the job. He says he didn't know what happened to Sheila. It makes no sense to me. Why kill one girl and leave the most dangerous witness, her sister, alive? Why cop to one murder of a child and deny knowing what happened to the other one? Why is he trying to distance himself from this part of the crime? I believe that someone did kill Sheila, but what Lloyd admits about Katherine is telling, leading me to believe that he was either responsible, Lloyd himself, for the killing or the dismembering of her. It's what's missing. My belief is that the Army duffel bag held the remains of Katherine, which is supported by the wireframe, the beads, everything else. Everyone said. It's unclear to me who at Taylor's Mountain knew about what was happening, but there are a couple clues that somebody did. People don't burn garbage in a controlled fire for a week that someone has to prepare for in advance. The second clue is the car. Someone had to find a place for it. And if it's true that it never came off the mountain, someone's barn it had to go into. So would Lloyd Lee Welch have sexually assaulted all these girls if he hadn't grown up in this family? We're never going to know. And I don't think ultimately it really matters. Lloyd Lee Welch is responsible for the murders of Sheila and Katherine Lyon, responsible for them. I believe that Lloyd Lee Welch went to Wheaton Plaza that day with the intent of abducting one or more girls. Remember that story we heard about the other girls who said that he put him in the car and they had to escape through the window. I believe Lloyd Welch drove the vehicle with his girlfriend Helen where they disposed of Katherine's body. I believe that by kidnapping her, he's also responsible for the death of Sheila. But after the reaction of neighbors, my bet is they wouldn't dare start another fire. To me, the evidence that Lloyd's dad, Lee Welch, was involved seems high. Lloyd implicated him, and so does Teddy. I'd been on the fence about his Uncle Dick, but the statements of West Justice carry weight for me since he corroborated some of what Lloyd said. I think the girls were abducted by Lloyd, taken to Dick's house, where they were seen in the pool room with Helen by both Wes and Teddy on or about Easter Sunday. I believe they were sexually assaulted, and eventually, when media attention became too big, became too hot, and they hadn't anticipated it, they were moved to Lloyd's dad, Lee's house, where a plan was formulated to end the lives of those two precious girls. I believe that Katherine was killed in the basement of 4714 Baltimore Avenue because of the forensic evidence and thrown into the fire at Taylor's Mountain. I believe that Sheila was taken to Taylor's Mountain alive because of what the witnesses in Manassas and Centerville said they saw in the car. I think instead of seeing two girls in the car, what they actually saw was Lloyd's girlfriend, Helen, and Sheila. I think Helen was in on it from the start. I hate coincidences. And one thing we didn't mention is that a red station wagon was stolen from a dealership adjacent to Wheaton Plaza on the same day the girls disappeared. The car was found a week later, parked in Hyattsville, where Lee Welch lived. Red car kept on coming up in Lloyd's stories. It was a different kind of car always, but it was red. My guess is Lloyd and the family had no intention of killing the girls, but probably didn't anticipate the media firestorm would put pressure on them to get rid of Sheila and Katherine. I think Lloyd made the trip back to the mall to mislead investigators. I suspect that Katherine's increasing anguish and defiance led him to kill her, chop her up in the basement, probably at least with his father's help. Lee, his father, then phoned relatives, alerting them that Lloyd was coming down with one of the girls. I think Sheila was in the car and was brought down alive. My theory is that Lloyd and Helen gave Sheila to Lloyd's cousin, Henry Parker, who had a history of sexual predation with his sister. Helen and Lloyd did this in return for helping dispose of Katherine's body. This is bolstered by the conversations that the Parker parents were having about Lloyd's involvement even before he got down there, and the call ahead that they got ahead from Lloyd's dad. Someone had to prepare before he got down there for that fire to be started. It's also bolstered by the fact that Henry was there and at the ready on the day and didn't ask questions when Lloyd supposedly said, absurdly, that he had a dog in the bag. I think Henry abused Sheila, killed her, and buried her somewhere in the mountains.
There are two other things that happened with Henry that point me in this direction. It's important to remember Connie and Henry had not talked in some time. As you'll recall, Henry said that Lloyd and Helen arrived at the Parker residence in a car, but his sister, Connie, said that Lloyd and Helen arrived on foot. I suspect that they were both correct because I believe that Henry met Lloyd and Helen before they ran into Connie, and that's why they had the different stories. Chances are that Lloyd and Helen handed off Sheila before they went up to the main Parker residence to burn Katherine's body. There was another thing Henry said that stood out. Just as Lloyd had speculated about burning before the detectives had a clue, Henry speculated that Sheila was killed with a tire iron on the way down to Taylor's Mountain. I believe that that's quite possible, like with Lloyd, that there was some truth to that, and that Henry possibly killed Sheila at some point with a tire iron.
My rationale for thinking Sheila was not burned in the fire is that the odor from burning Katherine's body was so strong that they probably never would have dared burn another body. So at the end of the day, in my mind, there's only been partial justice for Katherine and Sheila. Lloyd's in prison for the rest of his life. Good riddance. Lee Welch, as they say, lost his final appeal and died. World's a better place for it. Some people just should not be in circulation. Dick Welch is alive and should be brought to justice. And the other family members who lied and lied and lied to cover up these murders of those girls didn't do one day in jail, and they should be held account because justice delayed is justice denied.
Very, very well said, my friend. I love that you brought a lot of the very hard facts because I think that is one of the things that we can sort of get lost in the maze of words and the sort of tornado of information that has been thrown at us. But it's great to sort of extract that, bring it back down to the ground and say, hey, this is how it lines up. This is how the courts came to the decision to charge him. And this is how he was convicted and the basis of it. And to me, it feels very solid. It feels very much on the ground. And I am completely with you about the family and how many of them are still have escaped accountability to this day. If you're watching this on YouTube, we thank you so much for joining us. Feel free to email me at vintagevillainsPod@gmail.com or over on Instagram. You can also swing on over to the Facebook group, the Vintage Villains Soiree, and say hello. We're always happy to see new faces and discuss any of the cases covered on this show or any you'd like to see covered. And special thanks to all the Patreon members who get access to these live recordings as a thanks for their support. It's only a few bucks a month, but it helps more than you realize. And all the necessary links to that will be in the show notes. And so meanwhile, my friends, go forth and make good history, and I'll see you next time.
If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-driven Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I want to thank all of our Patreons who joined us today for this bonus episode. We appreciate you. We love the inspiration and encouragement that you give us. We'll see you guys in a few days for our next episode.